API management for API consumers. How hard can it be? Today we'll talk about this topic. API management oftentimes is thought of managing produced APIs, but we'll talk about consumed APIs. And for that, we say hello to David O'Neill, CEO and co-founder of API Metrics. Hey, David, thanks for joining. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Eric. I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's an interesting one for me.
Yeah, it is. And we actually started talking about this back in December at API Days in Paris, where we both, I think, listened to a presentation by Mark O'Neill of Gartner. And in his presentation, he made this interesting observation that API management tends to have this blind spot in terms of looking at consumed APIs. It very often is really focusing on the APIs that I produce, which of course is important. But the question is, aren't consumed APIs important as well? And then we started developing the topic a little bit. So how would you say, what's the state of API management for consumed APIs?
I think it's something people are starting to realize is an issue, but they've been so focused on what they're delivering that it's not really got to the top of the heap of things people consider. But I think there's another phrase I'd like to bring into this that combined with Mark O'Neill's observation that I heard from John Musser at Ford, and obviously formerly of Programmable Web, the concept of the API supply chain, because I think the two go hand in hand, that people consume APIs from a lot of sources and they have absolutely no idea what goes into them, whether it's a cloud service, a gateway, identity server. There's lots of things that actually impact how you experience the APIs that you are consuming as a company. And what I think we're starting to see is an emergence of sourcing groups and API product owners and product managers really realizing there's a delta here between what they have and what they need.
Yeah, and I absolutely love this idea of API supply chain management. I think it's a great term. And as you said, I think it is something that probably will evolve and we will see more of that. I totally agree. And I think another reason is just like how the whole API space evolves. Like we have more and more APIs available. People are using more and more APIs, but also that means the complexity of what we build more and more depends on other APIs. And if we don't know how well these APIs are doing, risk management becomes a little problematic. And your company, API Metrics, so you are kind of in the business of looking at APIs and figuring out how well they are doing. And what would you say is the most important difference between looking at APIs just sort of in the traditional API management or taking more this outside-in view that I think you are focusing on, where you look at the API really from the perspective of the consumer?
I think the challenge people have is it's the role that people have when they're looking at things, whether it's the developer building something or a DevOps team managing something, or the internet security team doing something else. That everybody has their own goals and interests. And I think the product teams in particular who own solutions or are selecting what goes into them are somewhat isolated from some of those end-to-end decisions. And it's quite hard to get the data, I'll be honest. Actually being able to make API calls with the same level of security, with the same design as an application server is something that took us 6 years to perfect. And even now, if you look at some of the tools people use in dev, they'll often work well in-house inside the firewall, or you'll write some JavaScript to get around some of the security, but it won't be an accurate view of how things work. I think what people are coming to realize is actually I want something independent, something that shows how things work in a way that's meaningful. I think a good analogy is something like you can't buy anything on credit without doing a credit check on yourself. Companies will not buy from any supplier without also doing some background checks of, is this company a valid supplier? Are they SOC 2 compliant? There's a whole list of things you have to do to work with large companies. We have bank customers, trust me, the list is extraordinarily long. And yet we see companies make decisions around APIs that will be part of their applications for years that are made because someone's used it before or it's very easy to integrate. And that probably isn't the right decision.
Yeah, I guess sometimes it's like the default choice, right? I think, it goes a little bit back to this good old Twilio campaign, right? Ask a developer, where it kind of also implied that, yeah, your developer decides that from now on we're using Twilio. And that may be fine, right? But it is something where you could also say, well, wait a minute, let's see, do we like it? Does it perform? Does it follow all the rules we need to follow, right? So I think another thing which becomes increasingly important is, for example, does it follow privacy regulations, right? That also is something that increasingly becomes something where, well, if you start using APIs in any shape or form with personally identified information, you want to make sure that the service that you're using is actually handling that in a legal way. And I think the complexity of that, right, is it will just be going up.
No, I agree. And you raised an interesting point with security, data security, data compliance rules, schema validation checks. If we look at the very regulated markets, the financial open banking ones, they're hitting all of these. Is your API FAPI standard compliant? Is the data you return in the format the regulations say it's meant to be? Are you returning it within the permitted performance boundaries? Well, we see that in jurisdictions like the UK, Brazil, Australia, and others. We're going to see that globally, and we're going to see it in more fields outside of just banking. And these are not numbers you can get reliably from inside your stack. And I think we're very used to pulling information from gateway logs and from APM tools. And if you're an API consumer, that's not necessarily what you want to know. I'd also say, going back to your thing of the Twilio thing, we see that all the time. And I think there needs to be a class of solution for developers when actually is Twilio the right solution for us? The answer is probably yes. They are very good and they're very reliable.
Yeah, I mean that's an easy thing there, right?
But yeah. but that's fine. Are there alternatives that could be better for you? There's a lot of it is a bad tendency we have in our industry, and not just APIs, across the tech industry, to click deploy where we know it works or it's the default setting, which is why so many services are hosted in AWS Region 1, because that was for so long the default deployment setting. And to this day, they are still sitting there. And you can see it from the performance profiles that, as you radiate out from Virginia, the performance gets slower because the speed of light is finite and sending data back and forth takes time. So there's a lot of things that we should be starting to pay attention to that I think Mark was touching on in his talk, that actually sourcing, risk, compliance, they all are starting to have a role in this. And the API product managers are the ones who are having to synthesize all this data from all these sources and really get on top of it for quite complex solutions that, 5 years ago, we weren't even considering.
And it's really interesting that you're mentioning the API product managers, because I think, right, these are kind of naturally the role that should really care about how does this product look from the perspective of a consumer, and how does it perform, how does it behave, right? And that's something, like you say, that you cannot really get if you look from the inside, where you are actually providing these things. And from our conversation that we had before we started this little video, it seems that this is also the kind of customers that you have, to a fair extent, these kind of insights that these teams are looking for in understanding how their service, how their products look for their customers.
Yes, most of our clients are from groups who are worried about the end-to-end performance, whether they have particular security requirements that make it very hard sometimes for people to connect. So they'll have an interesting networking setup with mutual TLS, whereby there's a handshake that's not easily seen from the inside, or they'll have a very complex security handshake process that could go wrong and therefore cause problems. The other piece we see is if you're a large provider and companies could build applications anywhere in the cloud on any infrastructure, a lot of people tend to forget that the world just isn't AWS shaped and or Azure shaped. And there are other cloud choices that people make, or even non-cloud choices. And you need to understand what the world looks like from that. And if you're looking at very secure services like banking, financial services, you can see very peculiar, for want of a better word, interactions between public cloud data centers and private data centers where there are extra security checks that just make them slower. One of our favorite ones is data centers in Finland tend to be slower than data centers outside of Finland. And apparently we're told it's because the Finnish data centers, for geographical reasons, have more security layers on the ingress and egress, because there are concerns about geography with one of their neighbors. So there are some very interesting things when you're deciding how you build your architecture and how you connect to different services and how you look at the world that need to have that holistic end-to-end view. And that's what we're at API Metrics trying to provide. And we're seeing more and more companies, the API product managers, the sourcing teams, the risk and compliance teams are saying, yes, we need to have this because we have to present it to third parties and we can't afford to mark our own homework.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of, looking at the world as it presents itself to your customers, there is something that, for people who want to check out things, so there's something that you provide, which is called, I think, the API directory. Is that the right term? So you correct. Have like a public API directory where you can check out some of the performance metrics, let's say, of a good number of APIs. Can you just briefly talk about this? And we'll, of course, link to it from the description. But I think it's just an interesting resource to start looking into, how do these APIs really behave for their consumers?
Yes, I mean, so there are lots of directories out there. We use some ourselves if we're looking for a developer docs or a open API spec. But what we found was there was no data on how things worked. So we've been gathering that data for the last 4 or 5 years across about 250 different API first technologies, everything from enterprise IT applications through messaging, banking, fintech. And we just thought that this would be an immensely useful data set for people to refer to. What we're doing is we have accounts with literally hundreds of providers, and we run queries across most of the things, a core set of the things you can do with them. And then we profile the API and we look at it from the point of view of how it performs from different clouds, where there are potential DNS or other connection type problems. And we look at we use a scoring system we've developed called CASK. That's Cloud API Service Quality. And that basically reduces the quality of all the endpoints and products inside a solution to a score out of 10. And if your score's above 8, you're probably okay. If it's below 8, you ought to look into things. And we, for our paying customers, we then provide tools that will say your score this will improve your score. But as a free resource on our website, you can go to the API directory and see ranking tables of how different services doing similar things compare, and actually see a detailed scorecard of how we came about the numbers. So it'll have uptime, availability, the number of outliers we detect, and a breakdown of the regional networking performance. And as we evolve, we'll probably give people access to the core data sets and the ability to, if you wanted to measure something for yourself, the ability to create a clone of what we've done and set it up to monitor yourself. So it's there as a free resource at the moment. We're also syndicating our scorecards into different directories. So if people wanted to add independent scoring from their own directory, they can take it from us. We want it to be a resource for the industry because at the moment, everyone's operating blind. And, as we talked about with Twilio, they make the Twilio decision that, well, that's great. That's a great technology. It just works. And it's often the right decision to make. But there are other alternatives, and you, for your application, should test those out.
Yeah, and I think that really is, I think this will move the API space forward as a whole. I think it really is an important thing to really start thinking about it like this. The resource that you're providing is one way of actually doing something about it. I'm sure there will be others popping up, but it's something coming back to the beginning of our conversation where I think as a community, we have to become a little bit more aware and proactive in terms of managing the APIs that we consume and not just the ones that we produce. And I think what you're doing and that resource, I think are really interesting ways of how that space will evolve. Any parting words from you, David?
No, thank you so much for having me. We could have, I think we could have talked about. We wrote down about 85 topics to talk about, so we could have been here all day. But I think we hit the key issues of that Mark raised for us in December, and that was it's a fascinating place to start.
Yes, I think it is. And well, since we did not talk about all the interesting topics that we also brought up in our conversation before the video, I think we'll have a good chance of having you back on the channel. Thanks a lot for joining, David. And thanks everybody for watching. If you found this interesting and liked it, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing. And with that, we are done for today. Thanks everybody, and keep getting APIs to work. Bye.
Bye-bye.